Based on the board games Arkham Horror and Eldritch Horror by Fantasy Flight Games, Arkham Horror Mother's Embrace by Asmodee Digital seeks to capture the intrigue of fighting eldritch abominations that those two games bring by altering it into a video game experience. What it instead brings is something of a slow, meandering experience that, while seemingly full of promise, ends up being a giant letdown by the time the end credits roll.
How dare you smashed my window? I hope you intend to have it replaced.
What light through yonder window breaks? It is my elbow! Ouch!
In the beginning of the game, you will start off by choosing one of several different investigators to meet with one Professor Tillinghast. Your character will be doing this for various reasons, it doesn't really matter. What matters is you go to her mansion, and you find the professor dead. You and various other investigators that you gain along the way will try to find out the mysteries behind the death of the professor and a plot to awaken the ancient old gods from their slumber. You know, the usual Friday night activities. The gameplay is primarily separated into two different segments: investigation and combat. During investigation, you are tasked with looking around the world for interactable objects. Find weapon and items that will help you in battle, all while working on moving the plot forward. Unfortunately, that's just about all that really happens in these segments. There are occasional puzzles that you will need to complete, but they can be a bit hit or miss. I generally found them to be either insultingly easy or extremely obtuse, without much middle ground. Along with this, you can sometimes run across things that will strain your character's minds. Whenever this happens, each one of your investigators will go through a brief skill check where they will either lose a bit of sanity or not. Eventually, if a character's sanity gets too low, they'll start to suffer from adverse effects, including self-harming themselves, being less likely to move sooner in battle, etc., etc. Each character can have up to 3 of these different effects on them at any given time, and if they continue to lose their sanity past this point, the effects will start to get worse. Luckily, once you have enough investigators to swap them out, you can have one that is suffering from these effects stay behind, and they will passively lose the effect in time.
These notes indicate the creature is actually Albert Hatcher, the Gravekeeper. How is that possible?
I've never even read of a disease that could cause such a radical physical transformation.
Was there a contamination? Or is this a natural process in the creature's life cycle?
I guess we won't be getting any answers from the Gravekeeper.
I'm no stranger to strategy RPGs, as Fire Emblem and XCOM are 2 games that I've sunk far too many hours in, and Arkham Horror's battle system is passable, but generally isn't very difficult or interesting enough to carry the main part of the game's interaction. It is, however, the better part of the gameplay, so while it isn't as good as the other titles I just mentioned, it at least breaks up the tedium of, well, everything else. Each character has certain traits that shows how proficient they are when battle time comes around. These traits let you know who's best at letting one's fist do the talking, when it's better to use ranged gunfire, if a character is good with magic, and generally how likely it is that they're going to take their turn first. Along with this, each character will also have some aspect that will help them when investigating. For instance, the Gravedigger is more adept at physically moving objects, while the Psychologist knows the best way to search the environment. What these do is essentially help provide clues, or sometimes straight up tell you which options to choose while investigating the environment. This makes it less likely that you're going to make a mistake and go insane during your investigation. But deciding which characters are going to be most useful for you is going to mainly boil down to luck. Story-wise, the game makes 2 cardinal sins, being somewhat nonsensical and being, well, kinda boring. Once you get through the story, you realize that major plot points don't really make a whole lot of sense, even more so than the normal level of disbelief that you would have to have when it comes to enjoying media about eldritch horrors. But still, all the playable characters in the game have no real agency, as they are all easily swappable between each other and the story won't be affected in the slightest. While this is necessary for the story to be able to move along smoothly, it comes with the side effect that none of them really are all that interesting. It might have helped if there was some risk of characters dying, but there's no real risk of any of your investigators dying permanently, a far cry from the board games where your investigators could drop very suddenly and violently. It also doesn't help that the game's identity as a budget title starts to peek through very quickly as soon as you run into criminally reused assets, with some of the main characters having multiple lookalikes, sometimes several in the same room. This also isn't helped by the actual graphics in the game looking fairly subpar. It feels like this game was originally intended for smaller, less powerful devices before it was decided to ship it for PC. The voice acting in the game is passable for the most part, with some characters sounding decent in their roles while others providing a somewhat hammy performance. But since all of the characters are meant to be interchangeable, none of them are really given an opportunity to shine, as the game drudges along, hoping that you'll stick around for the ride. The game is, well, it's basically a mobile title, where all you're doing is going around and selecting locations in the game world to interact with occasional combat sprinkled in here and there. Were they to have come out with a PC version of Arkham or Eldritch Horror instead of Arkham Horror Mother's Embrace, it would have probably been more well received, despite its less than stellar graphics. But the game we received feels like it may have been a well-intentioned, but hollow imitation that is generally lacking in just about every front.